please type them in the area for questions on your control panel. Robert will answer them at the end of the presentation. This conference is now being recorded. Welcome to the Center for Simplified Strategic Planning's webinar on Using Systems Thinking Strategically. Our presenter, Robert Bradford, is the CEO of the Center for Simplified Strategic Planning and the co-author of the Simplified Strategic Planning Manual, the best-selling book, Simplified Strategic Planning, a no-nonsense guide for busy people who want results fast, and in addition to other books and articles on strategic planning. Robert actively leads strategic planning in dozens of companies of all sizes in a wide variety of industries with amazing results. His real-world management experience and Ivy League MBA enable Robert to bring real nuts and bolts strategic thinking into every speech he makes. Robert, we look forward to your presentation on using systems thinking strategically.
Thank you, Denise. A couple of years ago, I was doing strategic planning work with a client, and after one of the sessions, the CEO came up to me and asked me, Robert, how is it that you think about things the way you do? And I pondered that for some time, and I recently started writing a series of articles on strategic thinking. And one of the key elements of this is what we're going to be talking about today, which is systems thinking. So obviously, because system thinking enables me to, think strategically the way I do, it must be important. But I also want you to be aware of three really important things about system thinking. First of all, in business and strategic planning, it's important to remember that all markets are systems. That is, they have inputs, they have levels of things that are changed by behaviors inside the system, and we can model them systemically. Also, we need to remember that complex systems have complex behaviors. And what this means is we can't always predict the outcome of something just by doing a surface level analysis. And finally, without good models, we can only work on the surface, and that means we can only work on really the tactical things at our disposal. There are controls that we have in our business. We can change our pricing, for example, and that will change the behavior of customers. It will also ultimately change the behavior of competitors. But that's a surface level tool. To get below the surface, you have to really understand the system that you're participating in your industry. And that's what this program is really about. Before I talk about systems thinking, I want to give you a little bit of background about Simplified Strategic Planning. Our organization has a number of professionals, all of whom have had top management positions in companies like your own. We've trained and worked with over 12,000 organizations in the past 25 years. I personally have done over 1,500 strategic planning meetings. And we wrote the best-selling book on strategic planning, Simplified Strategic Planning, have an average execution rate of over twice the norm, and 3 of the best companies to work for in the United States are, 3 of the 10 best companies to work for in the United States are clients of ours. Our view of strategy is fairly straightforward. What we like to think of as strategy is how we take your company from where it is today to where you want to be in the future. And we're going to do that by choosing a strategy that will steer your company, set a course through a number of environmental variables like markets, competition, and customers. To complete this and to lead to execution, we also want to come up with a set of integrated and compatible actions which will drive your company in the direction defined by your strategy. Everything that is strategic revolves around one of 3 basic questions. What are we going to do? For whom are we going to do it? And how do we beat or avoid competition? So all strategic issues, all modeling we do has to help us address these 3 basic questions. Systems thinking is one of the tools that we will use to address these questions. And just so you're clear on it, I'll give you my definition. Systems thinking is thinking that is based on a systems model. And a systems model is a model that explicitly illustrates the connections between processes and outcomes in a complex number of variables. The purpose of strategic thinking, and we're going to use system thinking to support our strategic thinking, the purpose of strategic thinking is to optimize our potential in terms of profitability, survivability, and growth ability. And I want you to be very clear that the idea here is that we're focused on the ability and not just the surface level results. That is, profit is something we obviously want to get, but in strategic thinking, we're really thinking about how do we build long-term profitability in an organization. And that may cause us to make decisions that will require a lower level of profit, for example, this year, in order to invest for the future. So let's talk now about understanding systems. And I want to cover three basic topics around understanding systems. The first is stocks and flows and just how systems function, and give you some examples of some systems. Then we'll talk about how you identify flows. And then the third thing I want to talk about is how we manage flows. And it's really an understanding of how we manage flows that helps us to come up with better strategies. So first of all, before I talk about stocks and flows, I'll give you a couple of key little points I use in my teaching. The first is we use what we remember. We remember short lists. We forget complicated things, and we remember exceptions. So I'm going to try and give you as much information as I can in short lists without being too complicated. And I'll also point out any exceptions that would be useful to you. So stocks and flows. A system that we're going to model can be described as a series of pools connected by pipes. So things from one pool flow through a pipe into another pool. And if you filled one pool up with water and it was connected to another pool by a pipe, you would expect water to flow through that pipe into the other pool until there's some kind of equilibrium between the two. The contents of one pool will tend to flow to the next pool through a pipe, and we have controls in our system. We have controls that will affect things that will flow from one place to another. Sometimes these things are very much within our control. That is, it's almost like we have a little valve that we can turn on and off. And sometimes these things are outside of our control. Just to give you one example, if I am selling ice cream, one thing that is inside my control is the packaging of the ice cream, the quality of the ice cream, and the price of the ice cream. Those things are all something that I can manage as an executive. Something that is outside of my control is the temperature outside. And the reason that's important is that sometimes the temperature outside is low enough that people don't want to buy as much ice cream, and that's outside of my control. And I need to understand that that will still affect the flow even though I can't control it. Now, the third point here is that every pool has a capacity, and every pipe has a capacity. And the capacity of a pipe or a pool can be increased or decreased by management, by investment, or by events. For example, if I'm running a plant manufacturing ice cream, the inventory, the freezer where I store the finished ice cream is a pool that I could expand by making the freezer bigger. I'd have to spend money to do this. There are reasons why I might want to do this. So I have more ice cream available to be shipped out when customers want it. But there are reasons why I might not want to do it as well, because it costs money to make that pool bigger, and it also costs money to have inventory in that pool. So that's something I can manage, and it will have an effect on my business. Now, the basic concept here is that there's a pool, and a pipe connects it to another pool, and through that pipe there's a flow that we can control in some senses, and other events may control that are outside of our control. And then things will flow into another pool. So in the example of the ice cream factory, you could have the work in process inventory be one of the pools. That is, the ingredients and the partially made ice cream that's in the plant being manufactured. And that would flow through the manufacturing process into the inventory in the inventory, the stock freezer. So that's a good example of a pool and flow. And obviously, as a manager, I can increase the speed of the operation, the machinery. I can increase the speed of the packing. I might buy packaging that packs faster. And all of those things will increase the flow from one pool into the other. So that's just a really good example, I think. Now, here's another example that almost every company has, and it's what I call the basic customer process. And the basic customer process actually starts outside of these 3 points with people who aren't customers and don't know who you are. And then through a number of mechanisms, such as advertising, sales efforts, and so on, we can build awareness, which is the first pool. So customers who are aware of your company are in a pool of people who could buy from you. Then through the sales process, they may flow from being aware of your company into actually placing orders with your business, whether it's for a product or a service. And that would make them then in the next pool, which is orders. And then finally, the fulfillment of those orders, when we actually take the order and say, okay, this customer wants this, and package it up and ship it to the customer, that's the fulfillment process. And that is an entirely separate pool, that is customers whose orders have been fulfilled through that process. So a couple of thoughts about stocks and flows that are important. First of all, if the flows into a pool exceed the flows out, it fills up. So for example, if the number of orders coming in if it's coming in faster than they are flowing out through fulfillment of actually packaging up and shipping out the orders, we have an increasing number of orders that have not been filled. And in some senses, that's a good thing because you can rely on that business for some time. But if the customer expects the order to be filled quickly, it can also be a bad thing because they end up waiting for longer than they would like to have their order filled. So the flow out of the pool, if it exceeds the flow in, then the pool starts to drain. So if we can fulfill the orders faster than they're coming in, then we don't have any orders sitting around waiting to be fulfilled. And in some businesses, that's considered to be a very important and good thing. Now, it's also important, however, to note that nothing can flow out of an empty pool. So one way you could balance out your orders versus fulfilled orders is by not having any orders come in. If you had a very low level of orders, that would be great in terms of the people who are measuring themselves on how many of our orders did we fulfill. But if the pool is empty, then the whole system isn't really doing anything because the whole purpose of your business is to fulfill those orders and meet the needs and preferences of your company. So that's important. It's also important to notice that nothing can flow into a full pool. If the computer that is storing the orders is so jammed up that it can't store anything else, the whole thing breaks down and you don't get any more orders until we start to take some orders out of that computer. So those orders end up having to go somewhere else, and they can end up being taken manually. They may end up with customers who went to a website and tried to order, and because it crashed, they didn't order, and that's a terrible thing. There are all kinds of things that can go wrong there. So it's important to understand that these 4 rules are very critical to these models. Now let me give you an example of a very simple system that I like to talk about a lot in the Simplified Strategic Planning Seminar, and that's the happy customer process. It's a very simple system model. We start with a pool of customers who are unhappy. If we were in the ice cream business, those customers might be unhappy because they don't have ice cream, but they have money, which is great because we would like their money. So when they go into the happy customer process, we get their money and we give them ice cream, and that makes them happier. And the amount of happiness that you're increasing in the customer is important, and it is also, of course, important how much money you're taking away from the customer. Good strategy is about optimizing that system. That is, you want to make the customer as happy as possible and take as much of their money as possible. But you need to wrestle with one really critical problem in the system, which is taking money from customers makes them unhappy. People don't like to spend money. They'd rather get everything for free. So you have to give them value. You have to make them happy to a proportion that is much higher than the amount of money that you're taking away from them. Here's another more complex example of a system, and this is a fairly simple one. I like to use this one. This would be an example of an association that wants people to come to their convention, for example. And their pool of potential is all the people in their industry. And their conversion process will be any activities they do in terms of marketing, PR, calling people, in order to convince the members to come to their conference and get the value from that of, the meeting with their colleagues and learning and so on. And that first order is very important in that conversion process because it's very difficult to get someone sort of over the hump into deciding to buy from you. But once they do, they come to your convention, and now you have an opportunity to do that 4th box, which is the secondary conversion. Now, in the convention business, the secondary conversion has 2 components that are really important. One is, of course, you want them to get and appreciate the value that they had of coming to the conference. And secondly, you'd like them to decide that they want to come back again next year and every year after that. You'd also like them to, as a part of the ongoing relationship, which is the 5th box, you want them to encourage other people in the industry to join the association and to become part of the pool of potential that we can draw from. Now, if you do this properly, properly managed, this cycle can lead to an ever-increasing return. If you mess up on any part of it, it can also be a sort of down the drain situation where you have a decreasing rate of return. So this is what we call a feedback loop when a system like this feeds back upon itself. And feedback loops can create some very complex behaviors, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Another example of a system that everybody participates in that affects strategic planning is what I call the value system. And the value system starts with a desire to build a business and usually build market share. And in order to build market share, we think about what our customers want, and we do something strategically that creates an advantage over competition. And that advantage over competition, once it is perceived as value, which is the center box there, by customers, they will start to decide to purchase from you, and they will leave your competitors to start purchasing from you, and that's great. However, there is another effectiveness that makes the whole thing complicated, and that is when they start to leave your competitors to buy from you, your competitors start to notice that you are offering a value that they're not, and it's taking customers away from you. And that leads to the third box there, which is competition. And that's a really good example of a fairly complicated thing. If you use this thinking applied to, for example, improving your service levels, this value system can have a fairly long cycle. That is, it takes competitors a while to recognize that customers are shifting to you because you're doing things better. And that means you have a longer time that you can enjoy the advantaged position. If you do it with something that's really quick and easy to change, like pricing, it usually creates a really rapid downward spiral in pricing. And that's why I like to say in most industries, pricing competition is usually a self-inflicted wound, because people choose this really quick and easy way to steal customers from competitors. But either way you look at it, this value system is very important to understand. Now, let's talk a little bit about how we apply this in your business. There are a lot of things that can flow into your work, and there are many other things that can flow out of your work. So when you sit down to start thinking about creating a systems model of your business and your industry, you want to look at what makes things flow in, and you want to look at where money flows in, where people flows in, where operational requirements flow in. And obviously a really simple, easy one for most people is, how does our sales process work? How do sales flow into our business? And there are things that can flow out of your work as well. Money flows out of your work. Products and services may, if you're a manufacturer, it will be physical products. If you're not, it may be a service. There may be some operational requirements that flow out of your work. But anything can flow in or out, and we can model anything. And one of the things I've noticed strategically it's very important is when you start thinking about these models for your business and your industry, if you pay attention to a flow that your competitors are not paying attention to, you can get a very quick and easy bump in your market share just by addressing a part of the system that they're not really built to handle. So what are some other things we want to look at? Well, one of the key things when we put this whole system together is to understand that sometimes problems occur because of the problem of managing flows. And there are 3 points I want to cover about managing flows that are really critical. The first is that efficiency increases as your prediction gets better. If you can forecast what's going to happen in the future better, your physical efficiency, your financial efficiency improves. A good example of this would be if we look at water delivery. Water delivery from the town public water works is very, very predictable, very well planned, and it's usually done with very long-term objectives. And that's because water demand, household by household or industry by industry, is usually fairly predictable. By contrast, if you are running a firehouse, you're also delivering water, but the efficiency is very low because the predictability is incredibly low. You know that at some point in the future you are likely to have to deliver a very large amount of water very quickly somewhere in your community, but you don't know where and you don't know when. And the fact that it's not predictable means it's far less efficient. You have a great deal of resource invested in that type of operation that is there just in case you need it. And often those resources are empty and not being utilized. That lack of efficiency is an important thing to understand, and it's not necessarily something that you have to avoid at all costs, but it's something you want to understand you must be compensated for that lack of efficiency where it occurs. Another thing to be aware of for managing flows is that the size of the pool can create a buffer between predictable and unpredictable processes. So if you have a highly variable, unpredictable process, you can create a big buffer that has much more capacity than you really need most of the time, but it can handle anything that the unpredictable process throws at you. And that's exactly the way a fire station works. You've got fire engines and fire people sitting around waiting for a fire to happen. And so that large pool size means that it can respond to an unpredictable event in the future. Flow management is another thing that we can do. And by flow management, I mean we can make choices that will cause increased or decreased demand on our pools. So for example, most fire departments will spend a good deal of time educating people, especially they go around to schools, for example, but they'll educate people on fire safety. And the reason they do that is that that manages the likelihood of there being, 6 big fires in a city at one time, for example. So they want to do things to reduce the flow in ways that they can. Obviously, you can't totally control whether fires break out, but they want to do what they can. The same thing's true in business. If you make choices that cause people to do things more predictably, for example, airlines will have lower ticket prices if you purchase your tickets early on and they're non-refundable tickets. And that manages the flow and it manages the predictability of people canceling or changing their flights at the last minute. And that's something that they do in order to make their processes more predictable. Here's another good example. It's a fairly typical one I see with a lot of manufacturers. It's what happens when there is a distribution system involved. And the example I use here is with a manufacturer. Let's say you manufacture something like a drill or something like that. And you sell this through a distributor to people who are in some industry. Let's say you're selling it to people who are in a metalworking industry. You don't have necessarily a direct relationship with the customers who are the source of the demand, which is the top box in this diagram. But they go to a distributor and they expect the distributor to have the drill that you've manufactured for them. The distributor, in order to keep their inventory about where it needs to be, is going to order a certain number of drills from you over a certain period of time. And that will of course be the demand that you have. But it's important to recognize that the key to this is not the distributor's demand for your product. It's really the fact that the customer expects that they can go to the distributor and get your product. So the demand from the customer is critically important to you, and you cannot sell to the distributor in the long run if there is not also demand from the customer. What that also means is, let's say you do something that increases the demand from your customer, like you do some advertising to the end users, and then they go to a distributor and say, hey, I want to buy a drill. If you do something like that to increase demand, it will affect the draw that the customer places on you. It will affect the orders that the distributor makes. But if you don't tell the distributor that you're doing this, they may have an unexpected and unpredictable change in their flows, and their inventory may not be sufficient. So let's talk a little bit more about system dynamics and how some of these things work. We obviously want to optimize system efficiency, and we can do that in a number of different ways, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. There also are different types of systems. There's steady state, oscillating, and geometric systems. And just to give you a sense of what that looks like, I'll show you a couple graphs. The steady state system, the graph would just be a flat line. That is, there's a fixed amount demanded all the time. A geometric tends to have this sort of exponentially rising curve, and we see these a lot. Everybody in the investment community likes to go out and show people geometric curves because it creates this expectation that if I buy $100 in stock in this company today, it's going to be worth $100,000 5 years from now. Now, that may in some cases be true, but it is important to understand that in a geometric system, usually the result goes up and up and up until you reach some kind of limit. Everything has a limit of some sort. And what you don't want to do is you don't want to be the last guy investing just before the whole thing breaks down. Often, a geometric system is actually the beginning of what we call an oscillating system. Here we've got just a random example of something that goes up and down. In this case, it's seasonal. It's based on months, but it could be year to year. Certainly, this will look familiar to you if you looked at economic data over a series of years. And an oscillating system usually goes up and down because there's some reason why it tops out and some reason why it bottoms out. We'll talk about that in a bit. Optimizing system efficiency requires that we understand not just the type of system, but we also have better prediction because that leads to better efficiency. We have a better ability to manage flow. We understand the things that increase and decrease the flows, and that will lead to better efficiency. And we also want to have some awareness of pool size and how that may allow us to accommodate changes, but also the effect that pool size is going to have on the efficiency of the whole system. So the types of systems, and I just showed you two pictures of the types of systems, and I said the steady state is a flat line. It's a system where the inputs and outputs match. It's usually very predictable, and a lot of people think that that's very attractive, but the expected efficiency is very high. So when I work in industries where there is almost a steady state type system and the expected efficiency is very high, the margins tend to be very low as well because there's a lot of competition and everybody wants that kind of predictable business. In the oscillating system where the flows move up and down, this usually happens when stock levels actually affect the flow itself. And that sort of feedback loop, that circular system that I showed you earlier, is the kind of thing that can become an oscillating system because, just as an example, in the conference example, if too many people show up for the conference, people may have a negative experience of that conference, and that may cause less people to show up the next year. And that would set you up for a good example of what I would consider an oscillating flow. I see this all the time in other businesses. A great place where I see this happening is at Disney World. If you've ever been to Disney World, when it's very, very crowded, the people at Disney are very happy, except, you know, they may be making a lot of money today, but there are a lot of people who, if they go to an amusement park on a day when it's totally packed, they have such a negative experience that they never go back again. And that will create an oscillation in demand for that type of business as well. A geometric system is where you've got this exponential increase. It tends to have a finite life. It often will end in catastrophe. If we go back and we look at oscillating systems and we think about it as an organic system like economics or bird population, whenever you see that kind of exponential growth, you know that at some point, for example, with bird population, the population is going to top out and start to decline because there are too many birds and not enough food. Same thing's true in economies, that if an economy grows too rapidly, it will top out and it will decline. And that's one of the reasons why, you know, nice little ups and downs in the economy are much better than big oscillations. And big growth is something that I worry about in the economy as well. So to finish up, I just want to give you one final example of a system that I've modeled, and I use this model a lot in strategic planning. This model deals with a really interesting flow that occurs within organizations, and it's tension. And tension usually comes from outside the organization, and then it gets digested into the organization. The organization has to deal with it somehow. But in a lot of organizations, I notice that there are three main points of tension that companies face. One is from your market. One is from finances. Obviously, you have to have money to do things. And one is from operations. There are just some realities that are very difficult to get around. Unfortunately, when attention comes in from the market, let's say, when a customer says, we want to buy your services, but we want to pay less money, that creates a financial tension because suddenly there's a downward pressure on your margins. And that can create an operational tension as well, that we start to push the operations to do more stuff cheaper. And the tension doesn't go away just because you're moving it around in the organization. And one of the keys to really good strategic thinking is to understand that that tension is part of a system that's flowed into your organization because of events outside of your control, but you have to handle it. And you cannot just handle it by pushing it into another part of the organization, but things don't work that way. Another system that we use, and this is what we talk about in the Simplified Strategic Planning seminar that we do, is strategic management. And most people think of strategic management as revolving around planning, but it's also planning and execution. And then we like to point out that if you do monitoring, not only does your execution get better, but you learn things that enable you to sit down and do planning better the next time. So if you want to learn about a process that builds on that and creates a sort of exponentially growing result out of your strategic planning in terms of profitability, survivability, and growth, our process that we teach in that seminar is really quite useful, and it fits in very well with some of what we've been saying. So what's necessary for good strategic thinking? How can you think more like the way I did when my client asked me, how do you do that? You want to have a sound approach, and certainly some of these systems thinking tools are good for this, and also the Simplified Strategic Planning Seminar has some excellent stuff. You need the commitment of your top management team. Without commitment, it's very difficult to make this work. It needs to be integrated into your management process rather than just a separate event. It actually needs to be something that is part of the fabric of how you do business. You need enthusiasm and good leadership, and if you don't have those, of course, you want to look for how you can build that. So that being said, I have 4 more resources I'd like to mention to you. The first 2 are a couple of articles. There's a link in the PDF file. If you are listening to the audio, you can email us from the website and request a copy of the PDF file. If you have the PDF file, you can just click on those links and those articles are available to you. Also, we have an offer to you. And again, if you're listening, you can call Elizabeth Tidd at 734-995-3465, or you can go to the link on the website. And for people who have come to this webinar, we have a special offer. Our seminar is normally $18.95, and you can attend for $9.95 if you use that link to register. Also, I would like you to succeed with this information, so if you have any questions or anything, I'd be happy to cover them now, or you can call me at 734-665-2971. My Twitter handle is @RobertBradford, all one word. I'd be happy to hear from you and answer any questions you might have on this subject. And with that, I'd like to ask Denise if there are any questions anyone has.
Thanks, Robert. Some great takeaways, thinking about the empty pools and the full pools, and what you can really do to change the efficiency and predictability of your inputs is very important. I have a couple questions that came up that people have typed in. Let's see, the first one. Do you have any examples of companies who have changed their strategy based on systems thinking?
Yeah, absolutely. One example I can think of off the top of my head that's a really good one. A company I worked with in Michigan some time ago, they were in the business of manufacturing printed forms that people would use, for example, for your taxes or something like that. And in their systems model, one of the things they looked at and they saw very clearly was that technology is changing how people use information that's structured. And the thing that they were very concerned about when they looked at this model was it looked like, and it actually turned out to be true, that the world is moving away from using printed forms for gathering structured information and towards using web pages and computer programs and so on. And so these guys, although they felt like there probably will never be a day when there are no printed forms, they said the number of printed forms is going to decline, and that's in our system, that means our sales and our profits are going to go down, and there's nothing we can do about it because it'll happen to the whole industry. So we started to look at what we could do strategically, and using this model, one of the opportunities that someone suggested was getting into printing other things. But what we realized was the forces that are affecting the use of printing to handle structured information, computerization and so on, those are also affecting people's consumption of other printed products. And so the pressure that we foresaw happening in our industry, we thought was also likely to come along in anything else we could print as well. And so that meant we had to take that whole idea of printing something else and throw it out and say, what can we do so that this threat, this thing that's happening to us, becomes something that propels us into a more successful future rather than just drags our sales down. And so we said, well, our expertise is not just the printing, it's also the structured information. So we started to look at how we could use technology to structure information better and how we could use our expertise, especially in this company is around taxes and things like that, without having people buy paper from us. And so this company went and acquired a software company and started getting into creating data and selling that software actually to other people who create data, and they've created a very successful, growing, and profitable business out of that while they've watched the print business decline. And so that was a really successful application of that tool.
Thanks, Robert. That was a really great example of the Forms company and how that transformed their business from printed to electronic. Here's another question. Does systems thinking apply only to strategic planning?
Systems thinking is something that it was originally developed in the 1950s. I'd say the seminal work on the subject was Industrial Dynamics by Jerry Forrester, which was published in 1957. And his original reason for writing this up into a textbook was to use engineering principles to help people design manufacturing operations better. So it's very, in some cases, a very tactical application, so it can be applied tactically as well. We like to apply it strategically simply because most people, when they get into strategic planning, they have this tendency of making the mistake of being very vague and sort of emotional about their business and not really looking at the system that they're functioning in and asking, how can we engineer this system? How can we engineer our business model so that it's more successful in the future?
Great. Well, that's all the questions that I have typed in here. If any of you have additional questions, please feel free to contact Robert. You've got both his phone number and his email address. And this concludes today's webinar. Thank you for attending Robert's presentation on how we can use systems thinking strategically. We look forward to your attendance at future events.